Hello and welcome to episode 22 of the Teachers Tea Time podcast. My name is Mark and I hope you're doing well. This podcast is about, by and for anyone who has ever had anything to do with schools and education. That's probably almost everybody. Topics and content in this podcast are listener generated. They come from listeners just like yourself. We are proud to be a member of Adjacent, a design collaborative made up of educators who dream of a better world for our students and their teachers. Learn more at adjacent.org. I have a mug of tea ready, so let's sit back, relax, and get on with the show. So today's podcast is a current events podcast that arose out of some conversations I had with my students over the last couple of weeks. We've been learning a little bit about the history of education in the United States. Incidentally, we're going to have some episodes devoted to this topic as an occasional series coming soon. Anyway, our class discussions are now starting to focus on current issues, and 1 year after the COVID-19 pandemic started, the rhetoric about learning loss. What my students wanted to know is this: is learning loss really a thing? So to really understand the issue, we should first try and understand what it is that we're talking about. Recent discussion about education in the media, and you'll see on social media sites, is often centred around the need to, right now, open up schools as we enter the latter stages of the pandemic. But to be accurate, let's be real, schools were not closed. Yeah, buildings were closed. But when you think about it, placing thousands of young people in poorly ventilated confined spaces when there is a pandemic caused by an airborne virus which has severe, if not deadly, consequences to those who contract it or get it from other people, is probably not the best way to contain the spread. So if you recall, teachers were instructed a year ago to switch their instruction to remote learning, leveraging whatever technologies they could use in the process. And at first, teachers were hailed as heroes for managing to keep instruction moving along in these difficult circumstances. But also think back. Remember, as the economy slowed and the price of oil crashed, economic interests began to take precedent. And there was a lot of agitation that schools needed to be open, basically so that free childcare could be provided and the economy could get moving again. As a result, the last 6 months has seen a battle to get schools to open safely, but with little or no funding to make that feasible. Meanwhile, many districts have continued to use remote learning, or other hybrid and high-flex models to make schools as accessible as possible without compromising on safety. Recall also, most states cancelled standardised testing last year. That was 2020. The federal data gathering measures were waived and students didn't really take any state tests. It was to great relief of the teachers. It was also to the relief of students and many parents. And I think for the first time in about 25 years, students really didn't sit any state tests. And you know what? The world didn't end. Teachers were still teaching, and kids learned as best as they could, while navigating all these new issues they were seeing. They were isolated, friends were sick, families were sick, some people died. They had to deal with the trauma of bereavement, economic hardship as the economy slowed down. And just, the just unusualness of everything. It's been a hard year for everybody. So what does all this sort of history over the last year have to do with this concept of learning loss? Well, it's to do with arguments, and arguments to get schools reopened. Remember, we've talked about this before. Schools do the job that the rest of society doesn't do. We've discussed this on previous podcasts, how the social contract is broken, and it's schools that try to take up the slack. So anyway, one of the arguments is that students do not learn as well using remote learning models as they do when they're face-to-face. A year ago, teachers were hailed as heroes. And now you'll hear talk about how they're lazy. They're on vacation all the time, and they don't do a good job delivering instruction remotely. Here's the thing. Remote instruction isn't easy to do well. If you go back and listen to episode 2 of this podcast, I shared some of the research about what works best. Well, the pandemic has demonstrated that the best pedagogues who taught face-to-face were the ones who centered instruction around the needs of their learners, who made topics and activities relevant because they were framed around the students' lived experiences. these teachers made the transition to remote and hybrid models of teaching with much more successfully than those teachers who struggled to do good teaching before the pandemic. Remote teaching and learning exposes those differences between strong and weak teaching, mainly because parents can now see, they get an insight into the classroom, and they can see and hear what is being said, what students are being asked to do, how the learning has been constructed. And actually, I've spoken to parents who now firmly believe that they know all about good teaching because they've been able to sit with their child and help them do remote learning. But we all know that teaching, learning, instructional design, it's a complicated business. Designing instruction for remote learning is not only complicated, it's time-consuming. Much more time-consuming than designing for face-to-face. And we all know there were teachers that didn't even plan anything face-to-face. They just show up and wing it. And because we're learning in these different multiple modalities, teachers are finding it way more stressful than traditional, old-fashioned methods of standing in front of a classroom and talking to them for an hour. So, if you want your buildings to fully open, basically so you can force your minimum wage workers back to work because now they have free childcare provided by schools, then you need to make a case that kids are not getting educated as well as they could. And here's the thing. To a certain extent, the folks making these points, they kind of have a good point. We kind of know that students who are from lower income households where the parents may be essential workers, they might not have that level of supervision and attention that more affluent families might provide. There's no doubt and no wonder that those sort of students have struggled. However, these are also the results of inherent social inequities that existed before the pandemic and were evident in our schools even then. I mean, just look at what students did better at doing homework. It's a similar idea, similar concept we have. Homework is not an equitable thing. Remote learning hasn't been equitable. So these people do have a small point. And we know that for the longest time, marginalised populations have not mattered in public education. Suddenly, when there's an economic imperative to get school buildings reopened, the learning is suddenly important. So I'm going to make a bold prediction here that once this pandemic is truly over, our policymakers, they're going to go back to not caring about disadvantaged and marginalised students. So I think we need to think about what they're saying as a bit of a myth. Teachers have not had it easy. They are not to blame for students struggling with their learning during a pandemic. We know that the same teachers who are good at teaching before the pandemic are really good teachers during it and will be excellent teachers afterwards. So why is there all this talk about learning loss? Well, we have to cast our minds back a bit further too. Go back to last spring with the cancellation of standardised tests. Remember that? For those who are uninitiated, these tests are written by large publishing corporations and testing companies. States pay for the tests and for the teaching materials and the textbooks aligned to the tests and for test-taking software, all out of their budgets. So effectively, it's taxpayers' money that goes to these huge multinational corporations that support testing. Well, last year, tests were cancelled. So that's millions of dollars of income not being made. There's an imperative for these companies to make sure testing happens this year. And one argument for tests to happen is so that learning can be measured. Parents need to see how far behind students might be because of online instruction. What does that actually mean? Behind who? Or behind what? I mean, we assume that a student who is behind maybe isn't meeting the state standard for that grade level. Okay, but there's a problem with this. Firstly, look at any state standards. They're arbitrary objectives written by a committee of educators and non-educators, approved by the politicians after an extensive period of public consultation. Effectively, they're not really grounded in much developmental understanding at all. State standards are effectively meaningless. So when policymakers talk about the need to get students caught up, what they're basically saying is that these arbitrary benchmarks which are different from state to state, haven't been met. And this is all during the collective trauma of a global pandemic. So there's also an implication when people use this phrase learning loss, that somehow students will have forgotten things they learned before the pandemic, because of not being schooled in the traditional way. You do hear about this every fall, when students come back to school having forgotten what they learned the year before. And therefore you see arguments for year-round schools and summer schools so that students can keep learning and not forget stuff. The problem with all of this talk about learning loss is it's actually based on a false and outdated understanding of how people learn. You see, it used to be understood that our brains were like a massive storage system, like a big computer, where we could learn facts and store them in a bank for retrieval later. The smartest people had bigger brains, it was thought, and so they could bank more information. The most skilled people were able to access and apply this information more efficiently than others could. And then you get these concepts such as intelligence quotas, IQ tests, and they come from this perspective about learning. In the early part of the 20th century, eugenicists took this one step further, connecting race and ethnicity to IQ, therefore implying that some people were just naturally smarter than others. And, it just happened to be connected to your race. And you may have heard people refer to others as low IQ. Well, that's really a euphemism for something else, isn't it? Well, this kind of was the way people believed learning happened. Okay? And the model contends that we have this finite amount of memory to use. Just like how computers have a finite amount of working memory on a chip. And school is the place where the useful stuff is learned and gets banked. So as we get older, our brains degenerate, so it's thought. And then we start to forget some of the things we learned. It was also thought that if we don't keep using our brains, we don't keep repeating that process of banking information, just like if we don't use a muscle, it will deteriorate. And some of that information will be lost. And this is what that phrase learning loss implies. But the thing is, it's kind of flawed, and it's very incorrect. You see, our brains are not empty repositories that get filled up with stuff learned in schools. Let's take this to a very basic, fundamental level. Learning is basically the connections of neurons in our brains. And our brains are constantly connecting neurons all the time, even as we get old. From birth onwards, our brains are learning. Every visual thing, every experience, every sense, every taste, every touch. That's connecting neural pathways. When children learn to walk, well, they do that when their environment has prepared them to do so. When children learn to talk, well, they do that better when they're exposed to lots of language. The brain files away all these words. It makes meanings. It develops its understanding. And it keeps building on its prior understanding. At the same time, our brains do a lot of basic things like remembering to breathe or regulating our temperature. And then at the end of the day, when we go to sleep, the brain's got to dump out anything that's deemed unnecessary and make better, more permanent connections for the stuff that's important. So our brains consign things that don't matter to short-term memory and, much like a computer, when you log off for the day, that gets wiped. While we're asleep, there's a lot of reorganizing of the neural pathways that goes on, and this makes things more efficient, much like when we clean and defragment our hard drives. And here's the thing. If we don't get enough sleep, that reorganization, that efficiency hasn't happened. And so when we wake up, we're confused and we seem to be forgetful, or we find that things haven't connected the way they're supposed to. Basically, it's because our brain hasn't had a chance to get things organized. And that's why sleep is so important, especially when you're trying to learn stuff. So we also know that our brain likes to connect neurons to other neurons. That's how learning happens. Neurons connect to neurons. And so it's kind of programmed to look out for what's familiar. What do we already know? So if we're interested in something, or we have a little bit of prior knowledge, or we have an emotional connection to a topic, we learn it much more effectively. because it's deemed important, and at night it doesn't get dumped to short-term memory. This is why it's hard to learn abstract things, because our brains don't have any existing neurons to connect that information to. It's also why, when you've been in classrooms where there's been lots of lecture and memorization of facts for tests, within a few hours or a couple of days of that lesson happening, it's easy to have forgotten that information because it wasn't important. Our brains couldn't connect it to anything. It was just an abstract thing there and then, or after the test is done, that's when it's forgotten about because we don't need it anymore. And our brains make that decision. It wasn't important. So let's think about this in the context of the last 12 months. Our students have had lots of distractions. They've had emotional issues of isolation and maintaining relationships with people, traumatic, pandemic-related issues, family issues, economic issues. Some students have had to step up and care for siblings and loved ones. Others have been able to do other things while at home. For example, my family learned to build a deck and redecorate the house so we could get it sold. Even when watching TV or playing games, our kids' brains have been constantly making connections and learning. And every night, when they go to bed, their brains are making decisions about what is important to keep, what needs dumping and scrubbing. And the thing is, while the whole world has been wrapped up in a collective trauma, school stuff, things like algebra, ancient history, Shakespeare, balancing scientific equations, for most kids that just hasn't mattered. So at a basic fundamental level, learning has continued unchecked. Important stuff that matters to kids has been learned. Unfortunately, that stuff isn't what our policymakers, our testing companies, and our state administrators want our kids to know. The pandemic has exposed how arbitrary our standards are, and how out of touch and irrelevant much of our school curriculum is. There really hasn't been any learning lost. Learning continued. It's just not been the learning that could be measured by a multiple choice test. And that's the problem. So now, when you hear someone talk about how there's been learning loss and how teachers haven't been teaching students and how students have been let down by educators, just take a pause and think, please. What do the people who are saying this most gain by going back to the way things were before? And then now we know a bit better about how brains work and how everyone's learning all the time, right up till they die. Why do these arbitrary standards even matter? And why do we need to test for them? If there is any positive to come from being in education during this pandemic, it's knowing that now is a great time to start to reframe these questions, challenge some deep-seated myths, and make schools and schooling something better in the future. So I've said it before, and indeed we had an episode all about how teaching and learning is political. And the pandemic has shown that this is definitely the case. This last year has made this just so clear. And it's often easy to find a phrase or a piece of jargon that seems to be self-evident on first reading, like the phrase learning loss. But when you examine it closely, it really doesn't mean anything at all, does it? So as we navigate the complexities of teaching, learning, schools and schooling, we hear these phrases used all the time. And like any propaganda, they're often emotive and designed to elicit a certain response. I'm really glad my students raised the issue of learning loss in class recently. Hopefully, we'll be able to take a deep dive into more of these buzzwords in the future. Also, if there are any neuroscientists out there who can explain the process of learning in better detail because, you are way more expert at it than I am, please get in touch. I would love to have you on the show, and your insight will be most welcome. But until then, that was episode 22 of the Teachers Tea Time podcast. This podcast is a proud member of Adjacent, a design collaborative made up of educators who dream of a better world for our students and their teachers. We create, write, talk, teach, and learn about the things that matter most in education. To find out more, point your browser to www.adjacent.org. That's www.edjacent.org. For me, it's the stories of teachers, students, and school communities that really matter. As such, this podcast is only possible with the help and support of its listeners. Please leave positive reviews wherever you are able. If you're an iTunes or Spotify subscriber, leaving a good review can really help our visibility. Also, please don't keep this podcast to yourself. Tell your friends to subscribe and listen too. One thing we all have in common is that we've been to school. So, if you would like to contribute to the pod in any way, everyone is qualified. If you have a story to share, whether it's long, short, tragic or comic, if you have comments to make about the podcast or just want to say hi, you can send an email to teachersteatimepod@gmail.com, or alternatively, you can send emails to me directly using mark@adjacent.org. I love to read what you have to say. If social media is your thing, you can follow me on Twitter @markdearcop. You can find our content information, copies of show notes, and you can download previous episodes of the podcast at www.teachersteatimepod.com. The podcast artwork was created by Phaedra. The opening and closing music is by Bryan Boyko. It's been my pleasure to be your host today. Thank you for listening.